Good evening. Can you hear me? Is this working? It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all and to have this honor of sort of moderating this event. I'm not quite sure exactly what is involved. I haven't yet learned to interrupt either Joe or Prabhat, but there's always a first time, I suppose. Well, first of all, let me first sort of thank the organizers of this event, including, of course, the Committee on Global Thought and the Heyman Center for the Humanities, which has co-sponsored this event. Professor Patnaik is well known, I'm sure, to many of you, but nonetheless, since he's relatively new to Columbia, I'll spend just a minute to introduce him. And Professor Patnaik and I first met, which was a very long time ago. This was the year of famine in India, 1966, and Prabhat had come to do a postgraduate degree and kind enough to take a mere first-year undergrad under his wings. But at that time, and the Indian cricket team toured England in 1967, were comprehensively defeated, not just comprehensively defeated, but patronized by the English cricket media and establishment. The world has changed dramatically since then now. I mean, India is now much more likely to win a test series against England than not. And of course, the talk of famine, and there was a conference held in India in '66 organized by Michael Lipton and Paul Streeton, which resulted in a volume called The Crisis of Indian Planning. Remember, Prabhat, it was all about, how on earth are we going to present, hundreds of millions of Indians dying of starvation. Because things have, and that's just by way of...
The microphone isn't working. You have to...
Is it working now? Right, okay, good, thanks, sorry. Things have changed quite dramatically since then, but of course things are always more complicated than that. Anyway, so Prabhat then went on, even before he had finished his doctorate at DPhil at Oxford, he went on to teach at Cambridge. Very kindly let me move into his Nuffield College subsidized apartment, but which I benefited from anyway. And then after a few years of teaching at Cambridge, Prabhat went back to India, Jawaharlal Nehru University, where he has been based more or less ever since, although he's been doing all sorts of other things, including of late being head of the State Planning Board in Kerala, which is, as vice chairman, is the executive head of the planning board, because the chairman is the ex officio chairman is the chief minister, as in the central government of the prime minister, the ex officio chairman of the planning commission. So he's currently doing that. He's on leave, I understand, from Jawaharlal Nehru University. He's extremely well known in Indian circuit. Anyone who's done any work on the Indian economy will be familiar with Prabhat Patnaik. Joe, I won't really bother to introduce, except to say that so far he has only won one Nobel Prize. But you all know him, and I shan't bother to really introduce him. It doesn't literally mean it when it says needs no introduction to this audience, or for that matter any other that I know of. Anyway, with that, I think what we will do is as follows. Professor Patnaik will make a brief kind of introductory statement, providing kind of historical context overview of where India is coming from. And then we will have a sort of discussion. I'll try and pose a few questions, and I'm sure the discussion will acquire its own sort of dynamics and so forth. But we won't, the questions will mainly be in the beginning between the people on the table, and at the end we will open it to questions from the audience, see how it goes and how long it lasts. Play it a bit by ear. But let's begin with Professor Patnaik. Thank you, Prabhat.
Thank you, Akbar. Joe, friends. I don't propose to keep standing here, but I thought the initial remarks I better make from here. It's a privilege to be part of this event. Really grateful for the honor. We were discussing briefly how I begin, what exactly I say. I think the question of where India is going, what's happening to India's growth, what's happening to Indian economy, and polity and society are issues which would be discussed in the course of the questions and answers. I thought it would be a good idea if I actually devote a bit of time, no more than 5 minutes, giving a very brief historical background, because debates about India in the contemporary context always invariably have a historical resonance to them. And why is that the case? I think one very obvious reason is that no economy in the world, and I repeat, no economy in the world had seen as much of free trade and as much of laissez-faire as the Indian economy prior to the First World War. We talk about neoliberal economic policies, but no economy to date has had as much of neoliberalism as the pre-First World War Indian economy. At the beginning of the 20th century, when the colonial government, for revenue reasons, imposed a 5% import tariff on cotton cloth, it actually also imposed a 5% excise duty on domestic production to make sure that the domestic producers did not have an undue advantage. At the end of the 19th century, there was a famine in Gujarat, and thousands of people died. In fact, famines dotted the history of India during the colonial period, and the district collector did nothing. And he was congratulated warmly for the courage he had shown in resisting the temptation to deviate from the principles enunciated by Mr. Adam Smith. So that is the level of laissez-faire, and that is the level of free trade that we are talking of. In a sense, it was exposure to the consequences of that, especially during the Great Depression, when the peasantry suffered greatly. As you know, the terms of trade moved against agriculture. The peasantry got into serious debt and was radicalized, and that's really when India's freedom struggle took off. That it is in response to that, that in a certain sense, India inherited a regime, or I shouldn't say inherited, India inherited a situation where a regime of the kind that came up after independence did indeed come up. If you like, there was an implicit social contract underlying the Indian freedom struggle. And it was the responsibility of the state to carry out that implicit social contract, which meant protecting the peasantry, which meant having the state intervene in a way to promote industrialization, because deindustrialization had been a feature of the colonial period. And of course, it meant that the state had to ensure a degree of equity in the distribution of the gains of development. As a result, in the immediate post-independence period, the kind of economic policies we had, which sometimes referred to as the Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy. Mahalanobis, for those who do not know, was a Cambridge-trained physicist turned statistician who was the pioneer of planning in India. And they, in fact, had this idea of developing an indigenous industrial base, developing basic industries under the aegis of the public sector. Since I'm in Colombia, I should say one thing very clearly. There is a view, which I'm sure would be current here as well, that Mahalanobis's strategy was based on the assumption of export pessimism. That basically you can, he gave an excellent example. He said, suppose you want fertilizers. What do? Either you import fertilizers, but you have a certain amount of exports, and once you import fertilizers, you can't go on increasing the import of fertilizers because your export revenue is not growing. Alternatively, you build up a factory to produce fertilizers, in which case you have built up a factory with your revenue, and of course you would go on getting fertilizers of a certain order after that. Or alternatively, you build up a factory to produce fertilizers. And so Mahalanobis, in fact, was in favor of the last option, and this is sometimes referred to as export pessimism, that really speaking, you have to produce a lot of these goods because you could not get them through international trade. But as a matter of fact, he had a more sophisticated position, and that position was the following, that basically the degree to which your exports increased depended on the kind of production structure you had. And consequently, if you wanted to be even a dynamic exporter, then you had to export at the more modern ends of the production structure, for which you had to change your production structure away from that inherited from the colonial period. For that, it was necessary that you actually build up the industrial base, and you have the building up of heavy industries and so on. Now, I think that regime, the Nehru-Mahalanobis period, laid the foundations for Indian development and had very substantial achievements to its credit. Two of which, one is pretty obvious, namely the whole industrial base that was built up, but the second, which is often not recognized, is that in the last 50 years of colonial rule, there had been a drastic decline in per capita food availability in British India from around 200 kilograms per person per year at the beginning of the 20th century to about 150 kilograms at the time of independence. Post-independence India, in fact, reversed this. With a lot of effort, it came up to about 180 kilograms by the end of the 1980s, prior to liberalization. Later on, when Akbar asked me questions, I'd like to argue that in the period of liberalization, this has actually gone down. In some ways, we are actually retrogressing. So, the point is that, people do not realize that the dirigist regime, the Nehru-Mahalanobis regime, is a regime that had fairly substantial achievements to its credit. But precisely because of the colonial experience, precisely because of the fact that the whole post-independence regime had been built on the idea of reversing the implications of free trade and laissez-faire, there was a certain resistance to neoliberal economic policies, and that resistance has historical roots. That resistance continues, and the reason for the continuation of that resistance is something which I'm sure Akbar is going to get to very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, after that, I think useful and excellent sort of context and perspective where India is coming from. Let's jump to today, and so what the headline news about India today is. And that is the news of rapid growth of GDP and exports, especially IT-related exports of India, of, some people even going so far as to talk of a kind of, the 21st century being one of three economic giants emerging, India, China, and the US, and of, and Indian Commerce Minister Kamal Nath was recently quoted in the Financial Times as saying, "We no longer talk of the future of India, India is the future." So that's kind of one view. Anyway, and you have a handout which we've sent out, and please don't spend too much time looking at it. Right now you can take it, but basically what it shows are these kind of trends of what's been happening, rapid growth, and essentially, from the kind of infamous Hindu rate of growth of from 3.5% during the 50 to 80 period, to a growth rate of about over 6% in the last 25 years, accelerating to about 8% in the last 3 or 4 years. And this is the kind of target that the 11th five-year plan also has in mind, 8.5% growth. But anyway, at the same time, of course, there's been this growing inequality that Professor Patnaik alluded to, and the whole debate, and before we get into, the causes, consequences, and sort of, prospects of India's growth performance, I'd like to see if you have a quick 2 words on this whole business of, and I think some of it is India sort of shining, glowing, rising, in what sense, to what extent. When we get into the debate on what's been happening to poverty in India, either Joe has just come back from India. Joe is It's true of almost any major country in the world that Joe has just come back from, and certainly of India and China. Joe, would you like to say something to?
Well, actually, I was in India in just 2 years ago as well, right before the election, and the party at the time, the JP, was running on a platform of India Shines, or India Shining. And I was asked to comment on that slogan at the time by some media, by TV, and I said, well, it is shining on 250 million people, which is a lot of people, but it's not shining on another 800 million people, which is more. And that I thought that was a dangerous political platform. Of my little experience in politics, I thought this was not a strategy that I would have adopted to make the people who were not enjoying the benefit more aware that there were other people who were doing very well. And evidently, my interpretation of the politics was shared by a lot of people in India. And there is a new government. The Congress Party got reelected in a complex coalition and the new government has focused a great deal on this other 800 million. The 800 million are largely in the rural sector. Let me just say, on the side of the on the side of the 250 million that are doing well, on this trip I went around a very large number of cities. Previous trip I'd been in Bangalore and Mumbai. You see, Bangalore is what everybody focuses on, is the IT capital. It's the you go there, you see. For instance, the Infosys, which is one of the major companies, its campus, as they call it, their company headquarters, the campus is more modern than anything I had seen in Silicon Valley. You know, they have all of the Pizza Hut, gym, all the facilities that young workers can spend 24 hours a day there and be happy without noticing the lack of infrastructure elsewhere, the poverty that lies outside the campus. This kind of IT, this kind of growth, you see all over the country. In Calcutta, which is one of the parts that have been very lagging, Chennai, Cochin, there is this bursting of economic energy is really a nationwide phenomenon. But the other side is, as I say, the 800 million are largely in the rural sector, and what is so striking is how close the failures are to the successes. You don't have to travel very far. You can do it within an hour, half an hour. And you can go within half an hour back 2,000 years. And you see a cross-section of the world, a history, people using primitive agricultural techniques. And it is that contrast that really represents the challenge for India going forward. The agricultural sector, the numbers that you passed out here said the agricultural sector had been growing at 2.3%. The numbers that I heard bandied around were actually lower than that, 1.6%, but whatever the numbers are, in the 11th five-year plan, they're talking about increasing those to 4%, but that's still half of the rate of the 8%, which they're setting for the country as a whole. And it's 800 million people who are in this rural sector. Moreover, the worry is they may not be able to achieve even these modest levels of success. In much of the country, the groundwater has been dropping at a very precipitous rate. The environmental problems of having large population increases in a limited space has meant that the demands in the environment have been very large. And in some parts of the country, there is a real worry that whether they'll be able to sustain even the growth that they've had, the limited growth that they've had in the past. So that's sort of this disparity between the successes and the parks that have not succeeded. Let me mention just very briefly before we, I guess, open up the discussion, one other major problem, and that is that even in the urban areas, while there's been rapid growth, there's also been very rapid increases in productivity. And everybody likes productivity increases. The problem is that the productivity increases have been so large that there's not been any employment growth, or very low employment growth. So even in the urban sector, there is worry about the ability of the economy to sustain growth, job creation for the vast majority of the people. The second thing I want to just mention is the bold experiment, probably the boldest experiment that has ever been undertaken in the creation of a rural guaranteed employment scheme. Every rural family is to be guaranteed, I think, 100 hours? 100 days. 100 days. I mean, 100 days. 100 days of work. It's a bold experiment. It was done earlier in one of the states, and now the notion is expanding that to a nationwide level. If it is successful, it will, I think, provide a model for many other places around the world. Two other issues that I'm sure we'll come back to, maybe just put them on the table. When I was there, the big debate about land acquisition. Modern industrialization, modern factories require land, and India has a large population, and most of the land is occupied. And that means land has to be obtained to be used for industrialization, and that means you have to displace workers. And the process by which that is being done is generating, to put it, I guess, a lot of excitement, and including hunger strikes. It's the drama that fills the newspaper every day. And the second thing that also fills the newspapers is the wave of suicides in the rural sector. And one of the things, trying to understand what are the causes of it, but it is certainly symptomatic of the other side, that there are some people who feel that society, that things aren't working well for them. And this manifestation is certainly evidence that for some people things are not working as well as they should in a very dramatic way.
Thank you. Joe has pretty much touched on a very wide range of issues, practically all the things that we wanted to talk about, I think, one way or the other. But let me turn now to this question, and I guess it's primarily for Professor Patnaik to answer. Obviously, Joe will comment if and whenever he feels like. And this is the question of this, the one that has been alluded to by both the speakers so far on, this, if you like, disconnect, if you will, between, on the one hand, a rapidly growing India, on the other hand, India in which inequality is rising, and there's a whole, the so-called great Indian poverty debate on exactly how rapidly poverty has been falling in the last 30 years. before, and I'd like Professor Patnaik to give us an assessment of it, and obviously there's more to poverty than just the income poverty measures and different indicators of nutrition and so forth. I'm sure he would like to comment on. Before I do so, let me just give you kind of, I guess, Prabhat, a very stylized thing, correct me if I'm wrong. The stylized view on India is that between sort of 1950 and 1980, there was really no significant trend in what was happening to the poverty rate as measured by the proportion of the people below some poverty line. Some fluctuation, but essentially, steady at roughly in the range of sort of 40 to 50% of the population, closer to 50 actually. And that's, there's only since about 1980 there's been some decline in the poverty rate in the proportion. But the great controversy on how much and how fast poverty has been declining, and indeed what has been happening also, not just people below the poverty line, to various other indicators of poverty. And Professor Patnaik, would you please? Oh, is that? I thought I was being very close to the mic. I get closer, right? Okay. And, well, Professor Patnaik, will you comment on what this great Indian poverty debate is?
Okay, can I just ask one question as you do that? While I was there, one of the studies that came out was a study that showed that the incidence of childhood malnutrition had actually gone up.
That's right.
And it was a source of a lot of debate, interpretation, because presumption is that if poverty is going down, shouldn't childhood malnutrition be going down? Does that mean two interpretations? One of them is the poverty numbers are wrong, more people are in poverty, or something else is happening to Indian society, that even though people are not in poverty, somehow they're not giving any money of their increasing income to their children. So that is also bad news for the Indian society. So either interpretation is a pretty dismal one, and I wondered whether he comment on that debate in particular.
Well, actually, there is not one Indian poverty debate, but there are two of them. And there is one debate which Akbar referred to, and that is a debate that takes place in the official circles. And that debate is concerned about, because they all agree that poverty may be going down, but how much it is going down by, and so on. That's to do with a certain method of estimating poverty. But the other debate, which does not figure as much in the official circles, is in fact a critique of the entire official estimate of poverty. You see, let me just say a few things about this. In India, poverty is defined in rural areas as anyone is poor who does not, on average, access 2,400 calories per day. And in urban areas, 2,150 calories. That's basically the definition of poverty. In 1973-74, on the basis of expenditure surveys and so on, it was found that people with a certain level of expenditure accessed that many calories. Now, since then, there is a poverty line which is that old expenditure level brought up by using a consumer price index number. Okay, so that's the official way of estimating poverty. But if poverty is related to the number of calories you have, then from the official data itself, you can actually get a direct estimate of how many people are below that many calories. And when you look at it that way, you find that poverty percentage, far from going down, has actually been going up, certainly in rural India. And this is not very surprising, because I just mentioned that one of the things which was an achievement of post-independence Indian government was an increase in per capita food absorption until about the end of the 1980s, when it reached about 178 kilograms per person per year. Since then, it has gone down, especially starting from 1997-98, it has gone down quite sharply, where now the per capita absorption of food grains is roughly at the level where it was on the eve of the Second World War. I think the latest firm estimates are about 153 kilograms, and if you believe that, okay, subsequently, I mean, because these are a bit dated, that look at some new estimates, might be 157. But whatever it is, it's way below what was the case earlier. Now, if people's consumption of food grains is going down, in that case it stands and is going down, not because of the fact that they are voluntarily shifting to all kinds of other consumption. And mind you, the figures I'm giving you are figures for the country as a whole. If that is a figure for the country as a whole, then for rural areas it is likely to have been much worse. And what is more, these figures include food that is indirectly consumed. For instance, you may have meat into which grains go, or you may have breakfast cereals into which grains go, and so on. So if you actually look at the direct consumption of grains in rural India, the figures must have gone down to an even greater extent. So there is this very strong argument for believing that contrary to the official poverty estimates, in fact, poverty, certainly in rural India, is likely to have gone up. And that would actually be compatible with the kind of information which just now Joe was telling us about, namely increase in malnutrition. And in fact, just the other day, 2 days ago, in New York Times, there was a report on this malnutrition among children. Now, I think this is something which actually makes me just come to one very important point, which I think, that often it is believed that India, the growth rate is very impressive. It's just the fact that growth is not touching many people. But if we make the growth even more impressive, it might touch. That means maybe 8% is too low. If we made it 10% or 9%, 9.5% or something, then more people would actually be beneficiaries of this growth. Now, I believe that's not a correct way of looking at things, because poverty has been going up according to the strict definition of the term, precisely at the time that growth has been accelerating. In other words, I think we are having a very peculiar kind of growth, which is based on a certain exacerbation of social antagonisms. In other words, it's growth which is occurring in a situation where some people's prosperity is necessarily related to other people actually becoming worse off. Now, if that is the perception, then an acceleration of growth would also give rise to an acceleration of antagonism, would also give rise to a worsening of many of those who actually are not on the right side of this divide. And I think a lot of the issues about land that Joe was mentioning are really related to this. You want to have higher growth, you want to have higher industrial growth. In that case, Mr. Kamal Nath that Akbar talked about setting up special economic zones. If you have special economic zones, you take agricultural land away. Now, since employment is not created for the displaced agriculturists in the special economic zones, you actually have a worsening, absolute worsening of the situation of the agriculturists. You have a high growth rate, and suppose it actually gives income to some rich people, then they demand a golf course. Now, you create a golf course by taking over some land, and of course you can always pay off the peasants because they are pretty destitute at the moment in the midst of agrarian crisis and suicides, and therefore, since they don't get jobs, they lose the land. A golf course is there, but they have actually become worse off. So I think that's the kind of situation I'm talking about, where it's not a question of growth excluding some people, that some people are just left out, but I think growth based on an exacerbation of antagonisms.
Thank you, Prabhat. At this point, can we turn a bit to the contrast with China and what's been that too has also experienced growing inequality in some sense with rapid growth.
Okay.
But more
Okay. I'll talk. Akbar asked me to contrast it with China, and there are some similarities and some differences. And some of these highlight the problem that was just raised. In particular, one of the interesting things is that China has just announced last March announced its 11th five-year plan, And India is going through an exercise of formulating its 11th five-year plan. And there are some parallels that help illustrate. For instance, the number one issue in China is also the growing inequality, including the divide between the urban and the rural. So that's very parallel to the problem. The words they use are a little bit different. They talk about harmonious society, and India talks more about more balanced growth. The instruments for doing this are somewhat different, and not a lot of confidence maybe in each. One case, there is no problem of unemployment in China, but there is really a problem remaining of poverty. But China has done a much better in reducing rural poverty. About 300 million people have moved out of poverty in China, mainly through an increase in agricultural prices, which they have controlled in the past, and which they have, since joining the WTO, have less direct control, but they've used exchange rate policy to keep a low exchange rate. And while there's a lot of discussion in the United States about the undervalued exchange rate, I think that their analysis, the U.S. government's analysis there, as in many other areas, is wrong. One of the reasons for China keeping the exchange rate low is that it keeps up agricultural prices. I think India would be well advised to have an exchange rate policy that is more sensitive to this, and that would help the agricultural prices. It is through agricultural prices that has been the most important anti-poverty program in China. How this plays out in India and related to the suicide problem, one of the suicides are particularly heavy in the cotton growing parts of India. American cotton subsidies, America subsidizes about 25,000 rich American cotton farmers divide between $3 and $4 billion a year of subsidies. Without those subsidies, America would not be exporting cotton at all. With the subsidies, we're the world's largest exporter. The effect of this is to drive down cotton prices everywhere. And this is where it fits into the liberalization agenda. The liberalization agenda meant that the government scope for subsidizing cotton was reduced, that it had to open up its markets to subsidize American cotton, and the effect of that has been to depress cotton prices from what they otherwise would have been, and lowering income in the rural sector. So that's an example of a common problem. Both countries have had problems in providing health and education in the rural sector, but literacy in China is almost 100%. India still has a significant literacy problem, primarily disproportionately in the rural sector. In China, the way they're responding in the new program is to eliminate school fees completely for those in the rural sector. They also have a problem in health. In China, Amartya Sen has been claiming that things have gotten a lot worse in the last 25 years in China in the rural sector in health. The disparity between life expectancy in India and China has narrowed, that India has been doing better. But one of the reasons, if you ask people about one of the reasons for the suicides in the rural sector, one of the factors is that there now is greater access to health, but people have to pay for it. And that means that people, if they become sick, become indebted to buy health care, particularly for parents or somebody else that in the family. And because their inability to repay those, they borrow money, often at very high interest rates, and the inability to repay those debts is one of the main motivators of the suicides. So, and I don't think that there is any a real concerted effort to try to. The challenge of doing that in India is just so huge that it's not part of the concerted effort. In China, there's an effort being made. A second area that is very big in China has not been emphasized as much in India, but eventually will have to be dealt with, is the environment. Very high on the agenda, and as I mentioned, particularly issues of groundwater will have to be addressed in the case of India, India's agriculture. On the other hand, some of the progress in India's cities is really remarkable and is actually a really interesting example where a Supreme Court decision in India saying that they had to provide clean air in Delhi has made an enormous difference, and the use of, almost overnight, the use of what do you call it? CNG has been really impressive, not only in Delhi but all over the country. Another interesting aspect of Indian, I should have mentioned this earlier, in the rural, the government court also said that every child has a right to a certain nutrition. And one of the impressive things that we saw are these school lunch programs. We visited some very impressive school lunch programs where they were providing lunches for thousands of students you know, at very low cost and improving nutrition before the report came out. So maybe the next report will show it. Really very, very impressive effort with a very strong role for NGOs in these efforts. A third area that is being talked about in both cases, but at different levels, is one of the main things in China is what they call independent innovation. China wants to have 10 global class universities within 10 years. Enormous investments in universities going on. The just report came out in India about the importance of improving the universities, but a real frustration about whether they will be able to get the resources they need to improve the universities. A real sense on the part of many that the Indian universities are not as good today as they were a few decades ago. So I think those are some examples of both parallels and differences between these two countries in their development strategy. But one of the real similarities is the growth sectors in both are very much related to globalization, to exports. And again, to come back to the general theme, in both it's the case that part of the country is doing very well, but other parts of the country are not participating in these successes.
Professor Patnaik, would you like to comment on?
No, I just want to draw attention to the fact that in both countries, the rural population has in fact been a segment that has been not only deprived, but has had a very difficult time of late. In China, there were 79,000 cases of clashes of the peasantry with militia during last year, again on these land-related issues, takeover of land. You don't have the kind of poverty on the Indian scale, but on the other hand, it's still the case that you have this substantial number of migrant workers, 180 million apparently migrant workers who go to the cities in search of work, and each of them has 9 square meters per head, which really is living under fairly abysmal conditions. So I think even the Chinese success, of course they had land reforms, therefore there is a certain minimum which is assured to every rural family because of the possession of land. But on the other hand, the fact remains that the rural population is equally deprived, relatively speaking, in both countries, which is why Hu Jintao recently talked about building a socialist countryside in China, which basically means the government is going to spend a lot more in the countryside. But the fact that that is being said is symptomatic of the fact that the government was not spending a lot more in the countryside earlier, which is exactly the same as in India. In India, during this period of liberalization, there has been a drastic curtailment in what one would call rural development expenditure on a whole range of things, social sector, even rural infrastructure. There has been a real drastic curtailment in expenditure there, which has contributed to a worsening of rural life. And this is supplemented. Joe talked about the price question, which of course is extremely important, but at the same time you have had withdrawal of state support from agriculture and petty production generally in a number of ways. For instance, earlier credit used to go to agriculture right until the end of the 1980s under a scheme where agriculture was considered a priority sector. A certain proportion of credit had to go to it at a certain subsidized interest rate. That's gone, and now increasingly you find that the peasantry has to live by borrowing from money lenders. You likewise find that subsidies on a number of inputs have been reduced, curtailed, therefore the costs have gone up. The price is going down, costs going up. The state support for the petty production sector, peasant production sector, has actually gone down quite dramatically. Sometimes it is said that the solution to this is to actually invite corporate agriculture that is going to introduce a new degree of dynamism into the agricultural sector. But as a matter of fact, that would only give rise to greater displacement of the peasantry, and the displacement would not be matched by the employment generated under corporate agriculture. Therefore, that will actually be a worsening as far as the peasantry is concerned. So the whole point is that the state has to provide some degree of support to peasant agriculture and to the rural areas generally. In China, at any rate now, there's a realization of it, at least going by the official spokesman's positions. But in India, that realization has yet to come in any noticeable, significant way.
Can I make two other comments about the difference between India and China? And one of them has to do with this point you mentioned about infrastructure. One of the most impressive aspects of China's success is the infrastructure. They've invested enormously in infrastructure. It's easier for them to do it partly because of the savings rate. The numbers that you have on the sheet, you talked about the savings rate in India having gone up very impressively from 13% in 1960 to 28% in 2005. But China's savings rate is 42%. And they've been working very hard. It was up to 50%, and they succeeded in getting it down to 42%, but mainly by revising the data and finding that they had undercounted GDP, and by increasing GDP, they got the savings rate down to 42%. But still, that higher savings makes it possible for them to invest in infrastructure, building a road network across the country, uniting the country in a way that it's never been united before, doing what in American mythology we talk about the railroads uniting America, bringing it together. That's happening in China. They're beginning of a talk of it happening in India, but it's still far from having occurred. The other contrast, or interesting contrast, is some of the political debate, the debate about reform. There's a debate going on in India now about capital market liberalization. The liberalization that they had before did not extend to opening up their economy to short-term speculative capital flows. And China is also not opened. I argue that the reason that China and India were the only two major developing countries to be spared the global financial crisis of 97-98 was that they had not liberalized their capital markets. India obviously regrets having been spared that crisis, and is therefore saw all the assistance that all the countries got in IMF aid, so it wants to have an opportunity to get IMF assistance. So the debate in India is to open up, I think I'm trying to be somewhat facetious, that there's a big debate about capital market liberalization in India. It's very strongly felt. Different people, even in the establishment, have different views on it. Some people say we're going slow, we're going to have, it'll take us 2 or 3 years. Other people say it's happening slow, that means that we'll talk about it and hopefully nothing will happen. In China, no one is really talking about capital market liberalization in that kind of way. So it's an interesting difference in the political discourse. Can I ask Prabhat a question? Because Prabhat is on the planning commission of the, as you mentioned, of Kerala, and Kerala is the state in India that has had the best health and education statistics, including the rural, in the rural sector. It's always held out as the example of success, of pro-poor growth or pro good social indicators in India. And we spent a little time in Kerala, and if you look there, you certainly feel see very clearly some aspects of that kind of success. On the other hand, there's been very low job growth, very low, 30% of the income in Kerala comes from remittances from abroad, and a lot of people have criticized the dynamic aspects of their economy. So since you're responsible for their economy, you want to comment?
Well, there is one very remarkable feature about Kerala, that Kerala had this very long history of excellent social sector achievements, as you mentioned. But during that period, Kerala was virtually stagnant as an economy. In fact, the material producing sectors were just not growing, whether it's agriculture, whether it's industry and so on. After 1987-88, for reasons which are not clear at all, you suddenly find Kerala growing very rapidly. It's not very clear why, but it is growing very rapidly. But that's precisely the period you find the social sector achievements begin to come down. In other words, the fact of high growth necessarily giving rise to better achievements in terms of the social sector is something which doesn't, in fact, not hold. What is more, even the opposite had happened in the case of Kerala. I think there has been a certain I think there has been a certain slide back as far as Kerala is concerned in terms of social sector achievements. This is true in schools, for instance. It's not as if every child, I was quite shocked that every child does not get milk in schools, which should be the case. And likewise, the public health facilities have suffered greatly, partly because of the shortage of doctors and so on, so that altogether you find that Kerala's social sector achievements are not as good now. Later on, perhaps I'll say something about what we are trying to do there, but let me stop for the time being.
Yeah. Before we open up to debate, let's have a few more questions. One of the issues raised is, why, the contrast between India and China. Some of the ones that have been, one is, for example, T.N. Srinivasan has drawn attention to much slower growth of employment in India compared to China. And one of the reasons he cites, part of this story is the rural story that Joe was saying, and part of it was that the TVE sector, township and village enterprises, were rapid growth and generated a lot of employment. In contrast, the small and medium scale industries in India grew much, much more slowly. Sean and Dres, and talking to Joe's point about integration in the global economy having impact on poverty, Sean and Dres partly attributed to the fact that because China had a much higher level of literacy and social indicators much earlier and much better infrastructure, its manufactured exports, which are much more labor intensive, could grow rapidly. But India had to rely on these, if you like, isolated enclave sectors like the IT service sectors, which generate much less job for the relatively low scale, but rely on very highly skilled people and the ability to create a cocoon like the campus that Joe visited. And this is related, therefore, to this issue of, the point that's been made that India has not spent or spent too much on tertiary education relative to primary education. It's a difficult question, this trade-off. I mean, it's an ugly trade-off. I think they're both obviously very good things, but in what sense, and is it true, Prabhat, would you say, and Joe, that where do you come out on that with respect to India's investment in education?
Personally, I totally disagree with this position that India has spent too much on tertiary as opposed to primary education. India's total expenditure as a proportion to GDP on all kinds of education taken together is lower than that of the apartheid regime in South Africa on the education of the blacks. I think it's a disgrace that we have not spent enough on education. Various governments have been talking about 6% as being the target, but we are way below 6% education. And I think this idea of India having emphasized tertiary, I think tertiary education, university education is absolutely essential for generating ideas in a society. I believe a society cannot live on borrowed ideas. You have to generate ideas, and it's a condition of the freedom of the people that you generate ideas. If not, then you take handouts from the World Bank, and that becomes your economics. You take handouts from somebody else, that becomes your politics, or you take handouts from somebody else, that becomes your history. I think it's absolutely essential that India should spend more both on primary and on secondary education. Professor Joan Robinson, who was an economist in Cambridge and Joe's supervisor at one stage, had a very nice remark. He said, any society that has the courage to cure the ills of capitalism would move on to socialism. Any society that doesn't have the courage to move to socialism would not be able to cure the ills of capitalism either. It's a bit like that. Any government that actually wants to promote primary education would in fact do so, no matter what it does about secondary education. But on the other hand, the government which uses tertiary education as an alibi is the government that really lacks the political will to do anything about primary education. I completely disagree with it. I mean, I think that societies like India should actually spend a lot more on education, including tertiary education. Now, by the way, this is an idea which now has gained currency. In fact, suddenly people are beginning to realize that basic sciences are ignored, humanities are ignored, social sciences are ignored, and therefore there's a lot more emphasis now on building universities. Unfortunately, it's taking a very wrong form. What they are saying is that let's have a clone of Columbia, let's have a clone of Harvard, let's in fact build what they call world-class universities. Now, I think that's nonsense, because I think universities must be related to the societies in which they are located. In fact, J.D. Bernal, who was this famous British scientist, who said even science education in India should be different from what it is in Britain, because the basic science you teach in India must be somehow related to the Indian problems, and that's certainly true of social sciences. So this idea of having clones of Harvard or Columbia in India is really something that would actually ensure that you build up completely second-rate institutions where no original work happens, and everybody would be keen to move to Columbia or Harvard at the first opportunity.
Yeah, let me just also say that if you look at the countries that were successful in East Asia, like Korea, they all spent a heavy investment in tertiary education. And in fact, one of the things that I did when I was chief economist of the World Bank was we issued the World Development Report, our annual report, where we focused on the important role of knowledge in development. And that actually marked the change in the World Bank's policy from focusing just on primary education to realizing that you need to invest in both primary and secondary. And in fact, if you look at what is the source of current growth, in India, it has a lot to do with the IT sector. And why is that? I think it has at least in part to do with the Indian Institutes of Technology, these first-rate institutions that were established by Nehru, and in some cases goes back over 100 years to institutions that were established in Mysore, which is the state where Bangalore is located. So I think quite the contrary, and I to what Tiang says, and he's wrong on most of the things he says, so it's not surprising he's wrong on that, that you really need to invest more in both areas. And I think that this commitment to having more investments in universities is one of the big contrasts that I mentioned before in China versus India.
Thanks. Shall we again say something, Joe and Prabhat, both of you might want to comment a bit on explaining. I mean, okay, we've been talking about the correlates of growth. That growth in India has not been poverty reducing. Indeed, as Prabhat Patnaik has argued, in some ways even been poverty enhancing. But can we discuss a little bit on what were the causes of India's accelerated growth? And there are these various explanations of why India, a lot of the story is told in terms of, I said liberalization, that because India liberalized, that's why it opened up its market, it's reduced protection, open trade and open to foreign capital. That explains India's rapid growth. There are other explanations. Some people say that actually it was preceded the liberalization, so you should see it, and it's not so much a liberalization story as a change in attitude of the government of India to the private sector. It became more pro-business in the 80s. So I mean, but that is essentially a story of the 80s and 90s. It's a more complicated story, some would say, or some would say it's a simpler and easier story. But in any event, the question is to both Professor Stiglitz and Patnaik is, how do you see the growth story in India, and what are its implications for future growth prospects? And do you think India has gotten on to an even higher growth path, about 8.5%, as the 11th five-year plan would like it to?
Well, as a prefatory remark, I would like to say that I don't believe either the Indian growth rate figures or the Chinese growth rate figures, because you see, one thing that does happen is that when people are unemployed, they are often disguised unemployed, and they therefore join the service sector. The service sector growth rate is calculated on the basis of assuming that the workforce has a certain average productivity, and on the basis of that you estimate. So often, in fact, a worsening of the situation as far as a part of the workforce is concerned might show itself in terms of an increase in the growth rate. There must be increase in growth rate. There is increase in growth rate. It is visible in many sectors, but I think this overall figure is something which I'm a bit kind of suspicious about. In any case, I'm not even sure that the overall figure means very much, because when you look at the 80s and 90s, in fact you talked about that, I think it's very important. In the 80s, the increase in growth rate, as you know, the growth rate in India began to increase in the 80s. Actually, when you compare the 80s with the 90s, in the 90s, when you take material commodity producing sectors, agriculture and industry together, the growth rate is marginally lower than in the 80s. The service sector is higher. But if you look at the 80s growth, in the 80s, you find that really a very sort of important contribution to this growth arises because of the spread of the Green Revolution to eastern India. In fact, in the decade of the 1980s, the highest rate of agricultural growth was recorded by West Bengal, not by Punjab or Haryana. Because the Green Revolution, which began in Punjab, Haryana, moved to western UP, then moves eastward, even to Bihar and to West Bengal during the 1980s. So the 80s growth is much more evenly balanced, in the sense that you have some increase in agricultural growth, some increase in industrial growth relative to the preceding decade, and of course some increase in the service sector growth, which is stimulated partly by government expenditure increasing, etc. In the 90s, agricultural growth collapses, and what you have is that even industrial growth is something which is not much higher than earlier, but service sector growth takes off. And I think that is the trend that we're also observing now. So I would say that firstly that I think, the factors underlying the growth have actually differed during the different periods. At the moment, what is happening is a very significant construction come real estate boom, together with some in IT has been doing very well. Okay, so the IT sector boom is very much there. On top of that, what you have is an increase in financial sector activities, which is then added to by a real estate and construction boom, together with some industries, garments, iron and steel, because the Chinese demand has actually given a boost to iron and steel industry everywhere. Garments, iron and steel industries, automobiles and auto components. I think these are some of the industries which have done extremely well in the recent period. But I think I think really one has to decompose the growth, and I think the causes of it will be different in different periods.
Yeah, I agree with what Prabhat said. Let me try to frame it though in terms of the big policy debate, which is why this particular debate has gotten such energy. The issue is whether liberalization, you call the neoliberal agenda, that is particularly associated with the current prime minister when he was the finance minister, that began I think in 1991, what they call liberalization. Whether liberalization was the source of economic growth, or whether there were a number of other factors in which liberalization may have played a role, but it was only one of several factors, and perhaps not even the most important one. And my reading is very much consistent with Prabhat's, that when you look at both the timing and the pattern, which sectors, you have to come away with the sense that that liberalization was not the most important factor. In particular, on the area of timing, the fact that growth began in the 1980s suggests, and what happened in the 80s, the most important change was the change from going from anti-business to pro-business. Internally liberalizing, getting rid of a lot of the regulations that made it very difficult for businesses to do business. So it was a whole change in what I sometimes call the internal liberalization of India that was very important and let loose a lot of energies. And I think one has to recognize that move it did have a fundamental effect on the Indian economy. And if you look at the numbers, you can really see it was a very successful era. The other aspect that was important, as you said, was agriculture. And one of the, it's not an accident, one of the things that played an important role, I think, in West Bengal was land reform. And the government playing a very important role in providing credit and doing a number of other things. West Bengal government is a communist government. And in fact, they tell me it's the government that has been re-elected, democratic elected government that's longest in power of any democratic government anywhere in the world. That it's been continuously in power now for 35 years. So it's sort of an interesting view of, but one of the reasons they've gotten re-elected is that they did a land reform and did a number of programs that increased the well-being of the rural sector. And they succeed. So in that sense, they were more successful on the rural side. They didn't have very high growth until recent years, but they succeeded on the rural sector. But land reform and the Green Revolution and agriculture, consequences of things, investments of the past, played an important role. Finally, when we come to the two other sources, one of them is remittances. Remittances are very important in Kerala. That has to do with the global economy and with investments in education that were made in Kerala. And finally, the other major source is the IT. Well, IT, one of the enabling factors for IT was the internet. That had nothing to do with India, One of the attributes, one of the reasons it was successful was mismanagement in the United States, the bubble that led to overinvestment in fiber optics meant that the cost of communication between India and the United States came way down. And so India was the unintended benefit of mismanagement of a liberalization IT policies in the United States. It could have been ruined, and one has to recognize that the fact that they didn't ruin it is important. Mexico privatized its telecom in a way that created a monopoly and has one of the highest telecom prices, and India has one of the lowest telecom prices. So the way they did it has opened up this industry. Had they done it wrong, it could have closed it down. But then again, I would say some of it is a result of investments made long ago. The Indian Institutes of Technology, investments in education, in tertiary education, really opened up the sector, which has been a source of enormous growth in India. So I think when you look at this whole pattern, you could only give a little bit of the credit to the liberalization agenda, the trade liberalization agenda.
Thank you. Before we open up, I just one final question actually, and this is mainly to Joel. I'm sure Prabhat will want to comment on it. Joe, there's a parallel debate, if you will, on India's growth performance to this one. One is people say that India's rapid growth is actually because it did not follow the Washington consensus neoliberal policies. It was precisely because it liberalized very gradually, because it had a many eclectic type of reform, that it didn't open the capital account, that in particular, and privatized in a much more measured way and so forth. And that is why, whereas others would say that if it had India liberalized, and the contrast drawn is with Latin America and other countries which have been at the receiving end of conditionality from Bretton Woods institutions. And the contrast is drawn where the others argue that, look, India had liberalized fast, it would have grown even faster. Because that's the...
Yeah. Well, I guess my view is very strongly that India has benefited a great deal from not having an IMF program and not following the dictates of the Washington Consensus, doing things more gradually. I think it's benefited not only because of the economic policies, but I also think it's benefited politically. In many of the countries where the IMF imposed certain dictates, certain policies, it became a political football, where the opposition said, you adopted those policies because they were forced upon you. And so the policies become controversial because they were imposed from the outside, and that becomes the source of debate. It was because India did it gradually. Many of the elements of the policy have broad support across the political spectrum. It was a result of the heavy political discourse. The wonderful thing about visiting India is that people argue. Senates talk about the argumentative Indian, and you go to India, and it's true that there is a lot of discussion of economic policies. There are disagreements, but there is a broad consensus on many of the elements of the policies. And I think it was because the policies were forged in a domestic debate through which a broad consensus on the basic parameters. Of course, there are going to be differences, like on capital market liberalization. But I still think even in this area, there's a difference between capital market liberalization when it's imposed from the outside and when it's the result of a domestic political debate. So I think India has been very well served by keeping out, by having a political framework where they've gotten to choose their own policy mix and their policy stances. I think if it had not been for that, I think the stridency in the political life in India would be very heated.
Prabhat, you want?
Just two comments. I completely agree with you. You see, but the fact that India did not reform, in quotes, very rapidly is not because of the fact that the reformers did not want to reform rapidly. It so happens that in India you had substantial opposition for historical reasons, for reasons we have been discussing, substantial opposition. Even now, for instance, capital account convertibility is something that they would like to introduce, but it's going to be very difficult because the government cannot do so without support of the left, and the left is completely opposed to it. So in India, what has happened is that it is really through the opposition that reforms had to face that they have been slowed down. Many of those who actually attribute the success of reforms to their gradualism are not those who are in favor of gradualism to start with. It so happens that they are actually making a virtue out of necessity. But at the same time, one can actually look at the other way around. In fact, I often feel that the problem with the Indian left is that it's so successful in blocking a headlong rush into reforms and therefore financial crisis that the economy is doing quite well, and so the left has marginalized itself in some ways. If they had not opposed it, and suppose the country had actually gone into a headlong reforms, then maybe a Latin America type situation would have emerged in India even earlier.
You mean 1917 Russia type situation? Well, thank you very much for your comments, and of course you can come back in your concluding remarks and talk about whatever else you want to say. But I think this, given the shortage of time, we should open it up to questions now.
What?
Thank you. I enjoyed your comments, and I'm a graduate of the business school. My question has to do with your agricultural, some of the comments on agriculture. One comment, first of all, I think, Mr. Stiglitz, it's a great idea to the exchange rate policy to keep up prices, and I think that's a terrific thing and should be broadcast more widely. I'm also a fan of as a business person, eliminating all subsidies, cotton, oranges, any of it. And I think the current administration, which I'm not a fan of, suggested cutting them by 50% in Europe through a tantrum. But that's, in any case, it would be good for India. But my question is this, this thing about the 100-day-a-year kind of guarantee, that sounds an awful lot like subsidies, and what I would ask your colleague here is, when does that become a handout? I mean, do you really think that a policy of guaranteed employment is going to work? The history of the 20th century is not good on that point.
So we take two or three we just take about 3 questions at a time. Why don't we go to you? That lady in the back. Or just give it to whoever you can find.
Yeah, there was a lot of comments about, increasing maybe subsidies or the education program, both for tertiary and primary schools. What I'm wondering is, what do you cut? Because it's always a question, you can always increase the expenditures, but then you need to cut as percentage of GDP on the other side. I was wondering, what would you cut, and is there any political barrier to do so, and how do you remove it?
Right. There's some, that's fine.
Recently in India, there has been a lot of talk of FDI, especially in the retail sector. Walmart is supposed to come into India, and especially now higher education, government is proposing 100% FDI. So I'd like to ask what opinion both of the speakers have on this particular issue. Plus, one additional thing was regarding the inequalities. There's a concern, there's an argument by the neoliberal camp that inequalities tend to increase initially, and then as country grows rich, they decrease. So what would you argue for that?
Thank you. Would like to
We start now?
Yeah. You take the question.
Okay, I'll quickly go through the questions. The question of employment, the employment guarantee. Government of India had a number of employment guarantee schemes before, but this one is actually a rights-based approach. That is the right of the individual household that one person from the household should get a minimum of 100 days employment. Now, it is true, of course, that sometimes you may not have projects on which you can employ them profitably. In Kerala, one of the things we are trying is actually getting a whole stock of projects that the panchayat, which is the local elected body, prepares, so the stock is there, and then you, and we are even thinking in terms of possibly incorporating agricultural operations, because it's not supposed to be, it's not meant for agricultural operation. You don't want to subsidize farmers through government money, but incorporating agricultural operations, let's say of marginal farmers or of group farming and so on into this. So it is possible that one can actually think in terms of worthwhile projects on which you can provide employment. By and large, at the moment, it's mainly on infrastructure projects, and not all of them are necessarily as kind of productive. But I'll give you my personal feeling. I mean, I believe with John Maynard Keynes that if people are employed, digging holes and filling them up, I have nothing to, I have no objections to it. I think it's very good, because the destitution which exists is something which needs to be overcome, whether or not in the process we are creating any worthwhile productive assets or not. That's my personal feeling. Then there is the question of cutting tax. Where do you cut? Well, you see, you can tax. Tax GDP ratio in India is not only much lower than any of the European social democratic countries, it is much lower than the United States. It is, in fact, if you look at central government taxation as a proportion of GDP, just central government taxation is about 4th or 5th from the bottom among all the countries. If you take state governments together with center, of course it increases a little bit, okay, maybe you are 30th from the bottom. But I think there's enormous scope, especially in a situation like this where inequalities have increased dramatically, for actually increasing the tax GDP ratio and using that for financing higher education, or using that for financing social expenditures. Walmart and FDI in retail. You see, one of the basic problems with FDI in retail is that it will create massive unemployment of petty retail traders, and I think that's a very important consideration. Inequalities, initially they rise, then they decrease. You see, the problem with all those conclusions is that they tend to think of countries as disjoint, that that each of them can follow the same path. As a matter of fact, countries are interrelated. For instance, you cannot understand India's economic trajectory without recognizing its colonial rule, obviously, which had as its counterpart its impact on the British economic trajectory. So insofar as the countries are interrelated, to imagine that each country can follow the same route as some other country did would not be a correct conclusion.
Now, let me just make a couple points. I think on the first issue, I agree very strongly that there almost surely are opportunities for constructive employment of public works in the rural sector. Infrastructure, rural infrastructure, talk about rural roads, the rural irrigation systems, maintaining irrigation systems in large parts of the country. So there actually is a large potential scope. Improving school buildings. There were a lot of decisions that were made at the beginning of the rural, still in the experimental stage. For instance, do you pay people below the market wage or the minimum wage, or at the minimum wage? One of the arguments is that if you pay them below the minimum wage, then there is a self-selection process that only those who really need it will sign up. If you have a job, you would go to job. If they're not, you would rather. So it really is identifying those who could not otherwise have worked. Unfortunately, the principle that it was too difficult to have politically to say that they would pay below a minimum wage, so that in most of the states, I think they are paying a minimum wage. I think that will make it more difficult for them to avoid some of the welfare aspects to it. But I think that they need to think more carefully about those kinds of issues. On the tax, my reaction was exactly Prabhat's about the problem of what to cut. The real question is increasing the tax revenue. In the contrast, Brazil has a tax GDP ratio of about 30%. Mexico is around 12%. To give you a flavor, you know, and so there are huge differences across countries. You cannot finance higher education, R&D, all the objectives on the lower end of those tax regions. You just need to have some tax revenues, and the fact that you can, Brazil has succeeded, has shown that you can do that even in a developing country. Finally, the view that there is a stage of development in which it's inevitable that inequality increases, called the Kuznets curve. It was based on earlier data. It's not true. East Asia has succeeded in growing. Many of the countries in East Asia, Korea, Japan, went through their critical stages of their growth and did not have significant increases in inequality. So the issue is how you grow and what policies you put in place. Growth does not necessarily have to help the poor, doesn't necessarily have to hurt the poor. It really depends on how you manage that growth process. And that's, you know, if it were inevitable, there would be no point of having a discussion. You just watch it happen. If you believe that there are policies that will make a difference, is why some of us think that this is an important issue, and that there are ways of shaping development policies that will reduce poverty and reduce the degree of inequality.
Gentleman just behind you, sorry.
Tough, hard question. I'll try to make it clear. I have the impression that India, as far as international relations, is still living in a shadow. It's a new country. I mean, it's when I worked in New Delhi in '75, Indira had to. It was no fun being an American. Let's put it that way. She was looking at Moscow, and there's China right there. Out of this, is there a geographical element to its lack of robustness? I see a country with 1 billion people. I'm wondering about the international relation power, almost a vacuum that I see, and any thoughts along those ways?
This gentleman, oh, sorry, I thought you were going to ask me this.
Hi, my name is Ashwin. I'm not part of Columbia. I'm just visiting here. I have a simple question, really. It's more political, but I would expect that, you know, economics is political at some level. I was just wondering, we spent probably a large amount of money on our defense, you know, budget, don't we? I was wondering if that is necessary. I mean, if part of that could not be moved to something else that would benefit the country as a whole. Especially because we were talking about raising tax revenues and so on. Thank you.
One more, we take one more in this round, and then two more actually, let's do two more.
Is that on? Actually, I want to draw your attention to the fact that we have probably the lowest rate of urbanization of any country. We have 29% urbanization, of whom about 60% live in illegal housing. So, you know, 60% live in slums and basically provide service to the richer middle class and upper class. So can we see, it's not just agriculture that's failing, it's all rural livelihoods. I mean, whether it's weaving or carpentry. Before the farmer suicides, we had weaver suicides in Andhra Pradesh. Every single livelihood that has sort of been traditional and that people have been doing in villages, either because of lack of demand or lack of marketing, that's a question that one can discuss. Is it that we have failed to urbanize? I mean, 71% of the population living in rural areas, none of these livelihoods are able to support them. So, and if agriculture is to modernize, it will become more capital intensive. So we will have a workforce that will have to do other things. So is urbanization something that India hasn't focused on? Our cities are overcrowded and there aren't enough of them.
Yeah, one more question, the gentleman just behind there, yeah.
You just talked about raising taxes, raising tax money. I just wanted to ask you, whom will you tax? You cannot tax the farmers in India. Very rich farmers in India are not taxed, earning millions of dollars a year. And you definitely cannot tax weavers, as was just said, because the communist government will come in. Just tell me whom you'll tax, that's all.
Let's end this round now. We'll take another round afterwards. Just wait. Why don't we let the speakers respond to these?
Yes, about geographical. You see, as far as Indian foreign policy is concerned, I mean, you know, I've got an expert sitting here. But fundamentally, I think there are two different kinds of pulls. One is the pull of Russia, China. You know, this whole talk of relation between India, China, and Russia. And the other is, of course, increasingly the pull of the United States. It's not unrelated to the kind of economic policies that the country is pursuing. I mean, I should tell you that when initially Indian planning began, it was a period of John Foster Dulles. And Dulles believed that, in fact, non-alignment itself was a betrayal. You know, whoever is not with me is against me. And likewise, this was mirrored in the kind of writings that used to come out from the US on Indian planning. The first time that India had some kind of relationship with the US, some kind of beginnings of a relationship was in '59 after Dulles's death, and 1960 when Eisenhower visited India. The World Bank gave the first loan to India only in 1959. Prior to that, they had not given any loans of any kind. So, but then again in the late 60s, when Mrs. Gandhi came, and again there was a kind of turn to the left in economic policies. Once again, you had very, sour relations between the US on the one hand, President Nixon, and Indira Gandhi on the other. So that, different periods of economic policy have been associated also with different kinds of relations with the US. At the moment, it is a period in which India is perhaps coming closer to the US, but that's related to the kind of neoliberal policies being pursued. But on the other hand, one can never say, because as you said, there's a certain geopolitical, geographical pull that is there, and then especially with Russia and China, it remains to be seen. But as I said, with experts sitting here, I don't want to talk about it. Defense budget, yes, of course. In fact, I mean, I think the need to cut the, I mean, again, from my point of view, it's my personal view, the need to cut the defense budget has nothing to do with spending more on education. Even if you are not strapped for funds, I think you should just need to cut the defense budget anyway. I mean, I don't see why. It's my personal feeling. I don't see why India should develop a nuclear device. I mean, I don't see why India should carry out all these, develop a bomb, and so does Pakistan. I mean, I think it's ridiculous for there to be a nuclear arms race in South Asia. And I should tell you that one of the topmost leaders in the government now, when the bomb was exploded, economists, it must be said to their credit, were absolutely shocked. Almost every economist, irrespective of their political views or irrespective of their views on neoliberal policies, they said, this is horrible, this is just not on. And well, okay, the Prime Minister himself, the current Prime Minister, had told me at that time that it does great credit to our profession that all economists have come out against it. Then, of course, he was in the opposition. But all right. Now, urbanization. Yes, you're certainly right that it is not just an agricultural crisis. I call it a crisis of petty production, because in Kerala it's most visible, but elsewhere too, weavers, whether it's cashew growers, whether it's fishermen, all the small producers everywhere are now faced with this crisis. You see, but the point is that urbanization would help, provided there were jobs for them in urban areas. But the whole point is that there are not enough jobs being created by these 8%, 9%, 9.5% growth rates. Now, if that is the case, then it follows that you will have to support them in their current occupations. You cannot have them thrown out and simply constitute a destitute mass that is going around looking for jobs which are not available. So it is extremely important that the state has to come and support them, in defend them, like in the case of peasants, if necessary, by protecting them against low prices of commodities which are imported. And Vidarbha farmers, suicides are going on. And these suicides are not stopping because of the fact that the price crash continues as far as they are concerned. The raw cotton prices continue to be so you have to nurture them into economic resilience, perhaps in the longer run, by introducing appropriate technological progress. That's not labor displacing necessarily, introducing different forms of organization like cooperatives and so on. But that's something which has to be done right there. I think the idea of simply pushing them out and then they find jobs is just not on. Lastly, there is this whole question of raising taxes. Who do you tax? You see, one of the points about capitalism, which I used to hear when I was a student, is that, listen, that through inheritance of wealth is no good, but enterprise must in fact be encouraged. As a result, social democracy believed, for instance, in taxing wealth. Okay, and that was supposed to be, let's say, the legitimization of capitalism, that it rewards enterprise. Okay, in India there is no wealth tax, absolutely no wealth tax, and peanuts. So that effectively, if you are saying who to tax, to start with, let's begin by taxing wealth.
Yeah, let me just comment on a couple of the points. One of them is, I think the question is right to emphasize that the problems are not just with the agricultural sector, but actually with much of the economy outside of the limited number of highly successful. But the issue of location, whether one should try to encourage more urbanization or not, is a more complicated one, because moving people from the rural to the urban sector imposes high costs. Building roads, building cities, these are very expensive. And one of the key elements, I think, of China's early success was a rural development strategy. It was a strategy where they moved the jobs to where the people were. Now they're going more into urbanization, but they have the wealth to afford the investments that you require for successful urbanization. Cities that are not well structured are very miserable places. And this is even true given that China had a much higher savings rate. But given India's lower savings rate, I think the cost of urbanization would be, in fact, very high. On the question of where do you raise revenue, there are two broad sets of revenues that are my favorite taxes. One of them is, I think there should be taxes on pollution and all kinds of negative environmental things. One of the ways to induce people not to pollute as much is to make it more expensive to pollute. And that includes, for instance, not only taxes, but charging them. For instance, one of the problems is that the cost in many parts of India, there are effectively no cost to charges on electricity, or very low cost. Electricity is subsidized for the pumps that pump out groundwater. So, in a sense, groundwater is a scarce resource. They're being subsidized in one way. It's bad environmental policy not to be charged for using scarce groundwater. But to make it even worse, they're being subsidized in the cost of bringing that groundwater and up to the ground and using it. So a whole set of environmental charges would actually, I think, enhance long-term sustainable economic growth and raise revenue. The other thing is, I think that there ought to be taxes, particularly on imported luxury goods. Now, unfortunately, with the WTO, it's more difficult to have tariffs on imported luxury goods than it used to be. But we figured out ways of getting around that. One of the things is that disproportionately, a lot of the luxury categories of goods are just imported. Relatively little of them are produced domestically. So you can design taxes on goods that are disproportionately imported goods. But even if you tax both domestic and produced and imported luxury goods, there's a wide area in which that can be done and generate income. One of the mistakes of the IMF policies that they've pushed countries around the world is to have the VAT as the sole tax. The VAT is a uniform tax on all goods. It's equivalent to a proportional wage tax. No democracy has had a tax system based on a proportional wage tax. But the IMF has encouraged countries all over the world to do this. They call it a VAT, but it's equivalent to that. And so I think if thinking about progressive indirect taxes, there are a whole set of progressive indirect taxes, is another important way of raising revenues.
Thank you. Shall we do one more round?
Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
We do one more round, I guess. Gosh.
There are lots of questions.
Lots of questions. Okay. That's good. You have to get nearer the mic, I think. Yeah. Why don't you move somewhere where it's easier for you to get hold of you?
I was hoping to hear your thoughts on the implications of the special economic zones on economic growth and labor, and what precedents, if any, it's setting for the regime of foreign direct investment in India.
Hi, I have a more general question. I noticed a big discrepancy between the male and female literacy rates in India, and I was just kind of generally wondering what kind of social challenges does India need to overcome in order to not impede their economic progress, and how important do you think that is to the short-term economic progress that they're expected to make?
I just have a brief question. Is it in the nature of the current phase of capitalism that while it is being talked about that there is growth of inequality in the developing world, India or China for that matter, but whereas on the other hand there has been increase in inequality even within the advanced capitalist countries like US, for example, after the Bretton Woods systems collapse. So is this in the nature of this present phase of capitalism that it leads to a rise of a situation in which there are two worlds being created within a geographical boundary of a nation, which earlier in colonialism it was related to two different countries, but here one world with destitution and the other world with more and more wealth, even within the advanced capitalist countries?
This question relates to Dr. Patnaik's comments on India's abysmally low expenditure on education, and I was wondering if you had any insights on why the expenditure is so low and what it would take for this to change.
Okay, good. Yeah, thanks. Could you talk about it?
Okay, special economic zones. Special economic zones to a very large extent are avenues of real estate speculation, because on special economic zones now it is suggested that in fact 20% would be occupied by productive enterprise and 80% would in fact be land that is available. This is being opposed, but on the other hand the special economic zones, a lot of them are just ways of cashing in on real estate speculation. But suppose we even leave that out. The whole point of having a special economic zone in which all kinds of facilities are provided is that it is discriminatory against those who are outside of it. If it was the case that you are actually starting industrial units ab ovo, then all right, you can provide some facilities. But insofar as there are already people producing outside, to have a special economic zone is implicitly a discrimination against them. And then there are all kinds of outlandish demands about, no taxation and so on, which even the finance minister, Mr. Chidambaram, is very strongly objecting to, and I completely agree with him. So I think the special economic zones is something which was thought of, I suppose, because in India we tend to do what the Chinese are doing. I know that has a certain kind of, fashionableness. But on the other hand, I think really there is not much argument in favor of special economic zones. And it's not surprising that the special economic zones now have raised enormous opposition because there are ways of taking over peasants' land. And believe me, that is at the moment the single most important phenomenon in Indian economic life. The whole question of land encroachment. When the Planning Commission recently developed the 11th plan draft, they went around the country organizing consultations. At all these consultations, the issue which came to the fore was the question of land encroachment. Is really issue number one. So I don't think there's much to be said for special economic zones. Male and female literacy rates, yes, I think there are very complex reasons for this, and the reasons no doubt would vary from one state to another. I mean, I think in patriarchy is of course the most obvious basic reason, but I think even the differences between male and female literacy rates are not as serious, for instance, in Kerala, as they would be in Haryana or as they would be in Bihar. So I think it varies a great deal, and of course I think this is something which has to be absolute priority as far as our kind of social achievements go. Not just because of the fact that female literacy rate, of course, has to be raised. Mind you, in many of these cases, male literacy rate is also pretty low. It has to be raised. I mean, in fact, we should have universal literacy. It's a disgrace, as far as India is concerned, that so many years after independence, we don't have universal literacy. It's a complete disgrace. But moreover, it is also said that a number of other things, like, for instance, birth rate and so on, are related to female literacy rate. So even instrumentally, it is really a very important part of development. Growth of inequalities, yes, I think one of the basic things which has happened is, of course, that unemployment, I mean, that in the Bretton Woods, I mean, in the period of Keynesian demand management, you actually had close to full employment in a lot of advanced capitalist countries, and you had religious development strategies in countries like India. I should say one thing, even though in India, the growth rate has more than doubled from 3.45 to 4% it was earlier, Hindu rate of growth, now is close to 8%. The rate of growth of employment has actually come down relative to what it was in the period of statist development. So you found that that there are much higher rates of employment growth, even though that did not eliminate unemployment, but that certainly put some kind of a check on the growth of unemployment. And in the advanced capitalist countries, you had such low unemployment rates that really is as low as you can get. I mean, in Britain, when I went as a student, it was 2% unemployment, which is really as close as you can get to full employment. Obviously, the increase in unemployment, which arises in this post-Bretton Woods period, I think it's part of the general pursuit of neoliberal policies everywhere, and the retreat from demand management by the states, which of course is not just a voluntary retreat, but is related to the emergence of globalized finance and so on, is something that actually has weakened the position of the workers everywhere and has increased the ratio of profits to wages everywhere. Finally, why is sorry, what's the last question? Why is expenditure? Sorry.
Why is expenditure in education so low?
Oh, expenditure in education so low. Why is expenditure in education so low? That's a complex question. I mean, I think, put it this way, I don't necessarily hold this, but I've come across people. I mean, not that I disagree with it, but I haven't made up my mind. But I've come across many people saying that, look, in a caste society, there is an effort to actually deny education to the lower caste, because that's a way of keeping social power. Perhaps.
Okay. Let me make a couple comments about the special economic zones. They were a very important part in China's success, but the reason they were in China was that China was a communist country that was trying to figure out how to move to a market economy, and so they said, we'll have a special area where we won't have the old communist rules. But because they were successful, there is a little bit of a sense of India imitating China, even though the circumstances for the motivation in China were totally different. So I'm among those who have some degree of skepticism about the special economic zone, the role of that in India. I think obviously there are some people who are looking for tax savings, and any context in which they can find tax relief or tax haven, they'll use that argument. So, and as you pointed out, I think fortunately the finance minister in India is aware of that and has been critical of the special economic zone for that argument for the special economic zone. The second point, is that there is a continuing worry that the special economic zones, it's sort of like free trade agreements. To what extent do they create trade, and to what extent do they divert trade? To what extent do special economic zones just lead to people who would have invested elsewhere moving into these special economic zones, and to what extent do they create new enterprises? Now, that leads you to ask questions about, well, what can special economic zones do? One of them is that they can provide infrastructure. And one of the problems in India is that there is a shortage of infrastructure. It would be great if you provided infrastructure everywhere, but given the limited amount of resources, it may be that you can say we can only provide the kind of infrastructure that is demanded by modern business, is to have it located in a few places, and let's focus our attention in getting world-class infrastructure. The absence of infrastructure is an impediment to investment in India. It's perfectly clear. If you don't have regular electricity, it's a problem. If you don't have access to other kinds of infrastructure. So I think that is one argument. A little bit more contentious, and I haven't made up my mind on this, is there are those who have argued that one of the reasons for the lack of job creation is oppressive labor regulation. And yeah, a lot of people disagree with that, but and therefore what they want to do is they have inside the special economic zone a different regulatory regime, to do experiments on regulations where you would weaken the social protections in these areas. I think that's risky, but it is certainly one of the arguments. At least some people have been arguing for the special economic zones. The most contentious aspect of the zones has been how the land has been acquired. That's really what's given rise. And whether, in fact, it is been acquired for legitimate public development purposes. One should recognize that this issue is arising in the United States, too. There was a Supreme Court decision in the United States in the state of Connecticut where the use of eminent domain, which is the right of the government to acquire land for purposes of, I think it was a shopping mall or something like that. And people said, is this fundamentally a public purpose? The Supreme Court said, yeah, that's enough of a public purpose to use the right of eminent domain. But it, I think, raises very serious questions. But at the minimum, I think that my observation, I don't feel like I'm an expert, but is that a greater effort needs to be put to make sure that those who are being displaced receive more of the benefits that are required. For instance, have income security. Land is important not only as, because the farmers aren't getting jobs elsewhere. They need the land as a source of income. It's also a source of security. There aren't good insurance policies that give you lifetime income guarantee. So the role of the land in the rural society is not adequately reflected in a cash payment. And therefore there needs to be a thinking about what are the roles that it provides, and thinking about economic measures, jobs, alternative land, bonds that give income over 30 years, 50 years, a whole set of instruments to I think, make the land acquisition process, if it's going to continue to make it more widely socially acceptable. I think that is absolutely imperative. And as I said, there are a number of things that can be done. I agree that on the second question about the importance of female literacy, and that there are obviously big differences between different parts of India. One of the interesting things is the fact that Bangladesh used to have very low female literacy and has had remarkable success in improving female literacy. The NGOs, BRAC, Grameen, have played a very important role in changing this, in creating schools that are focused on female education, in enhancing understanding of female legal rights, female education. So the fact that it was successful, that success suggests to me that it's not inevitable, that this disparity, and that really one ought to, that there are things that can be done to make a difference. The question on the growing inequality around the world, I think, is really one of the most interesting questions. And there are a number of forces that account for it. Some of it has to do with the forces of globalization. In the context of globalization, the forces that are at play in the North and the South are markedly different. At least some of the forces are markedly different. Standard economic theory would have one of the reasons why there's growing inequality in the North is that unskilled American workers are competing with unskilled workers in the developing world, and that's driving down wages on unskilled workers. That kind of argument would have led to the conclusion that there would be reduced inequality in the developing countries. That hasn't happened. And there are a number of studies that are trying to understand why what economic theory had predicted would happen has not happened. And it's not just in India, but it's elsewhere. One of the factors that's global in nature, that's related to, you might call the neoliberal agenda, is what Prabhat called attention to, the lack of attention to demand management, high levels of unemployment, focus on price stability, an agenda that says inflation is more important than unemployment, leading to high levels of unemployment, weakening the bargaining position of workers. I think it's led to a deterioration of the bargaining position of workers. Important. The second aspect where globalization has played an important role is there's been very big asymmetries in the liberalization of capital and labor. Capital can move around the world, labor can't. That weakens the bargaining power of workers. And so that, I think, has been another important aspect that has contributed to growing inequality. There are some other factors. Technology, changes in technology are biased against unskilled workers and favor skilled workers. And finally, there are cultural changes. There's been a breakdown, I think, in some of the social contract around the world, weakening of unions, what fraction of the ranks in corporations can be captured by top management has changed. What are acceptable norms of distribution have changed. So I think there are a number of factors, some unique to the South, but some that are common, that have contributed to a pattern of growing inequality, and this, in some cases, enclave that is a really concern around the world.
Thank you, Prabhat. Since you had the first word, you get to have the last word too.
No, just two very brief points. One related to this last issue, which Joe was talking about. Demand management, of course, very important. But imagine a world. I think Arthur Lewis, the development economist, had this idea that you can think of the world as a whole, and there are labor reserves in the underdeveloped countries, and the labor reserves keep the wages more or less at some sort of a subsistence level. Now, if you open up the world, then productivity tends to get generalized, and likewise the wages. Therefore, in both places you would find that since the subsistence wage does not disappear, labor reserves don't disappear, the low wages
afflict America, and the high productivity afflicts China and India, because of which you actually find growing inequalities in both places. The only other comment I wanted to make was in connection with this labor market flexibility and so on, and also special economic zones, lack of labor laws. You know, the correspondent of New York Times in China once told me that if you had as many mining accidents in India as you have in China, the government of India would have fallen long ago. And I really felt very happy hearing him say that.
Thank you very much.